What happens when the man sworn to protect you is actually the monster hunting you? Welcome to the shadows of 19th century America's past. Meet Sheriff Henry Plummer. He wore the badge, but he was accused of leading a vicious network of over 100 operatives who ruthlessly stole $6 million in gold. The ultimate punchline to this dark paradox: the corrupt lawman was dragged through the dirt and met his end on the exact same gallows he had built with his own two hands. Nicholas T-Bolt was not a wealthy gold baron or a hardened gunslinger looking for a fight. He was just a young man running a simple errand, carrying a small pouch of gold to buy a team of mules. But in the brutal winter of 1863, in the lawless expanse of the Montana Territory, that was more than enough to get you eliminated. When his frozen, battered body was finally discovered dumped in a thick patch of sagebrush, it did not just spark sadness. It ignited a massive, uncontrollable powder keg of public rage. The mining camps around Bannock and Alder Gulch were already drowning in a suffocating blanket of fear. The massive gold rush had violently transformed these remote valleys into a chaotic frenzy of sudden wealth. But that money brought a terrifying shadow. Miners who struck it rich were constantly vanishing on the remote stagecoach trails. Strong boxes were being violently ripped open, and armed guards were being silenced in the dark. The discovery of T-Bolt's tragic remains was the absolute breaking point. The townspeople suddenly realized a horrifying truth. The official legal system was completely paralyzed. Every time a highwayman was actually arrested, they mysteriously escaped from their holding cells. Critical evidence would simply vanish, and key witnesses were found silent before they could ever testify in court. The honest citizens finally understood that they were completely on their own, trapped in a remote, freezing valley entirely controlled by a phantom syndicate of ruthless operatives. Driven by pure, desperate survival instinct, the community decided to completely bypass the broken courts. In the freezing, pitch-black nights of December 1863, a group of furious, terrified men began to gather in total secrecy. They did not meet in brightly lit government buildings or formal town halls. They huddled in hidden cabins and dark cellars, speaking in hushed, urgent whispers. These were not seasoned gunmen or military soldiers. They were ordinary merchants, exhausted miners, and desperate fathers who had simply endured enough tragedy. Under the flickering light of oil lanterns, they made a solemn, heavily binding pact to take the law completely into their own hands. They officially formed the Vigilance Committee of Alder Gulch. This marked the terrifying birth of vigilante justice in the region. It was a uniquely dark chapter of the American frontier, where ordinary citizens willingly stripped off their civilized identities, completely abandoned the concept of due process, and transformed themselves into a highly lethal, unregulated faction. They were no longer waiting for a corrupt judge to hand down a sentence. They were going to clean the territory themselves, one rope at a time. The newly formed vigilantes immediately launched a highly aggressive, clandestine manhunt. Their relentless pursuit quickly led them straight to a known, highly suspicious associate of the criminal underworld named Red Yeager. The Vigilante Committee absolutely did not bother with formal arrest warrants, legal jurisdictions, or reading him any constitutional rights. They simply tracked him down, surrounded him in the unforgiving wilderness, and forcefully dragged him out into the biting winter air. The interrogation of Red Yeager was not conducted across a wooden desk in a secure room. It was held under the cold, indifferent light of the Montana stars, entirely devoid of any legal oversight. The furious mob simply threw a heavily knotted hemp rope over the sturdy branch of a nearby cottonwood tree and firmly secured the noose directly around Yeager's neck. They did not raise their voices or offer any complex legal plea deals. They gave him an incredibly stark, brutal ultimatum. He was standing on the absolute precipice of eternity, and the only possible way to even slightly delay his inevitable drop was to provide them with the exact names of every single man involved in the criminal syndicate, standing in the howling wind, feeling the rough, scratchy fibers of the hangman's knot pressing tightly against his throat. Red Yeager's criminal loyalty completely evaporated. Driven by a frantic, desperate survival instinct, the terrified outlaw completely broke. He decided to trade every single secret he possessed in a massive bid to save his own life. Yeager systematically pulled back the heavy curtain on the entire dark operation. He revealed that the massive, terrifying network of highwaymen officially called themselves the Innocents. It was a deeply ironic, sickeningly mocking title for a massive network of over 100 hardened thieves, ruthless operatives, and opportunistic predators. Yeager breathlessly detailed their highly organized structure. He exposed their secret passwords, their covert handshakes, and the specific hidden markings they used to quietly identify the stagecoaches that were heavily loaded with valuable gold shipments. He gave the vigilantes an entire, highly detailed roadmap of the sprawling criminal empire that had been slowly bleeding the entire territory dry. But the vigilantes demanded the ultimate prize. They pulled the rope just a fraction of an inch tighter and demanded the name of the mastermind. They needed to know the specific identity of the man who possessed the sheer logistical brilliance and the deep inside knowledge required to successfully orchestrate such a massive, flawless criminal enterprise without ever being caught. Red Yeager swallowed hard against the rope, looked at the circle of heavily armed men surrounding him, and delivered the absolute most devastating bombshell in the history of the American West. The supreme leader directing every single dark ambush, coordinating every massive gold heist, and deliberately sabotaging every single legal investigation from the inside out, was the exact man they had democratically elected to protect them. The mastermind of the Innocents was Sheriff Henry Plummer. The revelation hit the secret committee like a paralyzing physical blow. The very man who pinned the shining star to his chest every morning, the man who confidently promised to uphold the peace, was actually the chief architect of their absolute worst nightmares. The badge was not a symbol of justice. It was the perfect disguise for a highly calculating monster. It perfectly explained why the criminals always knew the exact schedules of the gold transports, why the deputies were always sent in the completely wrong direction, and why key evidence mysteriously vanished from the locked sheriff office. Plummer had essentially weaponized the entire legal system against the very public he swore to defend. The horrifying realization that their own chief law enforcement officer was actively hunting them fundamentally shattered whatever remaining trust the citizens had in a civilized society. If Red Yeager genuinely believed that handing over the biggest, most shocking secret in the territory would miraculously buy his freedom, he drastically underestimated the cold, calculated fury of the Alder Gulch vigilantes. They stood in the freezing darkness, silently listening to his entire detailed confession. They carefully memorized every single name and location on his comprehensive list, and then, completely devoid of any mercy or hesitation, they simply kicked the wooden barrel out from under his feet anyway. They watched in total silence as the man who held the secrets faded in the cold winter air. The end of Red Yeager was merely the opening act of an unprecedented, massive wave of retribution. Armed with the incredibly detailed roster provided by the fallen man, the Vigilance Committee officially abandoned all restraint. What immediately followed was a terrifying, relentless 6-week campaign of absolute, unfiltered terror. The vigilantes completely bypassed the entire concept of a fair trial, legal defense, or a jury of peers. they aggressively transformed the entire Montana Territory into a massive, open-air tribunal. In less than 2 months, over 20 suspected members of the Innocents were systematically hunted down in the middle of the night. They were violently dragged from their warm cabins, pulled from saloon poker tables, and forcefully taken out into the freezing wilderness. There were absolutely no judges, no defense attorneys, and no final appeals. The only justice administered during those dark 6 weeks was the swift, terrifying snap of a rope over a sturdy tree branch. The citizens of the frontier had fully embraced the darkness, becoming the exact same ruthless, uncompromising force they were desperately trying to eradicate, all in a frantic, deeply controversial attempt to finally rip their stolen town back from the hands of a corrupt sheriff. How does a man orchestrate a sprawling empire of violence while simultaneously convincing an entire community to hand him the keys to the jailhouse? To understand this deeply unsettling paradox, we must completely erase the stereotypical Hollywood image of the 19th century Western outlaw. We have been conditioned to picture frontier criminals as filthy, uneducated brutes, men with rotting teeth, foul mouths, and a natural tendency for loud brawls in dusty saloons. If Henry Plummer had fit that crude description, the desperate citizens of the Montana Territory would have never trusted him for a single second. But the most dangerous predators in human history rarely announce their arrival with a menacing growl. They arrive with a warm, disarming smile. Henry Plummer was the absolute antithesis of the typical frontier roughneck. Born into a respectable, highly educated family back in the state of Maine, he possessed a remarkably sharp intellect and a polished, natural magnetism that immediately drew people into his orbit. When he walked down the muddy, chaotic streets of the Bannock mining camp, he looked like a visiting dignitary rather than a hardened frontiersman. He was incredibly handsome, always impeccably groomed, and dressed in beautifully tailored, expensive suits that sharply contrasted with the filthy canvas and leather worn by the local prospectors. His boots were always polished to a brilliant shine, his posture was flawlessly straight, and his vocabulary was articulate and sophisticated. He was a true gentleman of the era, famously known for pausing in the muddy streets to politely tip his finely brushed hat to the ladies passing by. He spoke in a soft, reassuring, and highly persuasive tone. In a brutal, lawless environment, overflowing with desperate, dangerous men, Plummer appeared as a shining beacon of civilized society. He represented order, refinement, and absolute safety. This is the chilling reality of the charismatic mastermind, a dark psychological archetype that would later become a highly studied phenomenon in modern criminal profiling. Plummer perfectly utilized his undeniable charm and educated background as a flawless, impenetrable shield. He understood a fundamental flaw in human psychology. People desperately want to trust a man who looks good and speaks well. He weaponized his refined manners to blind the entire local community to the absolute darkness hiding just behind his eyes. But that darkness was not a recent development born from the chaos of the gold rush. To find the true origins of his hidden nature, we have to look far beyond the freezing mountains of Montana and trace his footsteps backward to the sun-drenched valleys of California. Long before he ever arrived in Bannock, Plummer had already completely shattered his civilized facade. He had previously secured a position in California law enforcement, proving his unique ability to manipulate the public trust early on. But his badge in the gold fields of Nevada City was quickly tarnished by a highly volatile, completely reckless personal life. Plummer became deeply entangled in an illicit, highly dangerous affair with a married woman. When her husband, a man named John Vedder, naturally discovered the betrayal and attempted to intervene, the polite, well-spoken gentleman from Maine did not back down or apologize. Instead, Plummer drew his weapon and ended John Vedder's life in the dark. This brutal act of violence completely stripped away his refined disguise and exposed the remorseless operative lurking underneath. The California courts convicted him of the act, and he was sentenced to serve out his days within the notorious, heavily fortified walls of San Quentin State Prison. Being locked inside one of the most brutal, unforgiving penitentiaries in the nation should have been the absolute end of his story. However, fate intervened in a deeply twisted, highly unexpected manner. While serving his time behind those thick stone walls, Plummer received a completely different kind of sentence. The prison doctors diagnosed him with an advanced, highly aggressive case of tuberculosis. In the mid-19th century, consumption was essentially a guaranteed, agonizing exit delivered by nature. His lungs were rapidly deteriorating, his physical strength was fading, and the medical experts officially declared that he only had a few miserable weeks left to live. Based entirely on the premise that he was a fading man breathing his final, pathetic breaths, the governor of California granted him a medical pardon, simply allowing him to go home and pass away in peace. But Henry Plummer absolutely refused to fade quietly in a prison bed. The terminal diagnosis did not bring him a sense of peaceful resignation or a sudden desire for spiritual redemption. Instead, it seemingly triggered a massive, highly destructive psychological shift. If you are a man who possesses a staggering intellect, a massive ego, and the absolute certainty that your days on earth are severely numbered, the standard rules of human morality suddenly evaporate. Knowing he was essentially a walking ghost, coughing into a pristine handkerchief, Plummer developed a frantic, insatiable thirst for absolute power, total control, and immense wealth. He had absolutely nothing left to lose and no future to protect. He fled the jurisdiction of California, escaping into the sprawling, highly chaotic wilderness of the Northern Territories. When he finally rode into the booming, desperate settlement of Bannock, he carefully reconstructed his gentlemanly disguise from the ground up. He completely hid his dark criminal record. He suppressed the violent coughing fits that racked his diseased lungs, and he presented himself as a seasoned, highly educated professional, offering his valuable services to a town drowning in chaos. He played the local political game with absolute, terrifying perfection. He listened to the deepest fears of the local merchants. He promised the terrified miners a swift return to law and order, and he charmed the influential figures of the community with his articulate, highly compelling vision for a safe, civilized society. The public deception was an absolute, undisputed masterpiece of psychological manipulation. In May of 1863, the citizens of Bannock made a monumental, historically catastrophic decision. Blinded by his tailored suits, his polite demeanor, and his highly convincing promises of peace, the desperate community officially elected him as their sheriff. They willingly handed a shiny gold badge and absolute legal authority to a convicted fugitive, a terminal patient with absolutely nothing to lose, and a highly calculating mastermind. The townspeople genuinely thought they were finally hiring a loyal sheepdog to aggressively protect their vulnerable flock. They had no idea they had just ceremoniously invited the absolute most dangerous, ravenous wolf in the entire territory directly into their home, locked the heavy wooden door behind him, and willingly handed him the only key. With the sheriff's star pinned firmly to his tailored coat, the charismatic gentleman from California did not just enforce the law, he completely swallowed it whole. Handing the ultimate legal authority to a highly calculating mastermind triggered an immediate, catastrophic explosion of tragedy that would forever stain the legacy of the American Gold Rush. The 70-mile stretch of rugged, winding trail connecting the booming mining camps of Virginia City and Bannock rapidly transformed from a hopeful path of prosperity into a guaranteed trap. The hard-working prospectors who had spent months breaking their backs in the freezing streams, finally accumulating enough raw gold dust to return to their families, were suddenly stepping into an elaborate, inescapable nightmare. Stagecoaches departing from the local assay offices, heavily loaded with wealth, rarely reached their final destinations intact. Instead, they were continuously ambushed with a level of military precision that left the local community completely paralyzed with confusion and fear. But this was not random frontier banditry. This was the birth of the most sophisticated, deeply entrenched, organized crime syndicate the 19th century had ever witnessed, all orchestrated from behind the protective shield of a lawman's desk. The sheer brilliance and absolute depravity of his underground empire lay in his total manipulation of the justice system. By holding the highest law enforcement office in the territory, the sheriff controlled the entire flow of vital information. He knew exactly which stagecoaches were carrying the heaviest strongboxes, the precise schedules of their departures, and the exact number of armed guards assigned to protect them. He would sit in the local saloons, casually sipping whiskey, all while quietly listening to successful miners bragging about their newly acquired fortunes. He would then casually suggest the safest travel routes for these wealthy individuals, directly funneling them into perfectly coordinated ambushes waiting in the surrounding canyons. When a violent robbery inevitably occurred, and terrified survivors came rushing back to town seeking immediate help, the chief architect of their misery was the very first person to comfort them. He officially recorded their tragic statements, feigned absolute outrage, and dramatically organized massive, heavily armed posses to hunt down the phantom culprits. But these righteous pursuits were entirely rigged from the start. He would intentionally lead his deputies in the completely wrong direction, allowing his men ample time to vanish into the wilderness. If any physical evidence was accidentally left behind at a crime scene, he possessed the absolute legal authority to personally collect it and ensure it mysteriously disappeared before a judge could ever examine it. He was playing an intricate, high-stakes game of chess against a community of desperate, unsuspecting pawns, and he controlled every single piece on the board. The sheer scale of this invisible empire was absolutely staggering. This was not a small, chaotic gang of desperate outlaws looking for a quick score. The sheriff had systematically recruited, organized, and commanded an army of over 100 hardened operatives, ruthless highwaymen, and opportunistic predators. They operated under a highly cynical, deeply mocking moniker that perfectly encapsulated their twisted sense of superiority. They officially called themselves the Innocents. This massive criminal network functioned with the ruthless efficiency of a modern corporate enterprise, deeply embedded within every single layer of the mining community. His men were not just hiding in the distant hills. They were pouring drinks behind the local tavern bars, working at the livery stables, and even serving as legally appointed deputies within his own law enforcement agency. The honest miners were completely surrounded by predators without ever realizing they were caught in the middle of a massive den of wolves. To maintain absolute operational security and prevent this massive network from collapsing under its own weight, the syndicate relied on a highly complex system of covert communications and secret identifiers. In a booming territory overflowing with transient strangers arriving every single day, the gang members needed a foolproof method to recognize each other in crowded saloons or during the chaotic moments of a stagecoach ambush. The mastermind instituted a series of chillingly brilliant protocols. The primary verbal password for the syndicate was a deeply arrogant, highly ironic phrase. If challenged in the dark, a member would simply state, "I am innocent." This singular phrase, spoken in the right tone, was the ultimate key to the underground kingdom. But the most terrifying identifier was entirely visual, hiding in plain sight on the dusty streets of Bannock. The members of the gang were instructed to wear a standard Western neckerchief, but they tied it using a highly specific, intricate knot resembling a sailor's tie. This unique, completely uniform styling became infamous in the criminal underworld as the Henry Plummer knot. To the untrained eye of an honest prospector, it was simply a stylish fashion choice. But to the predators roaming the territory, that specific knot was a clear, undeniable badge of allegiance to the untouchable sheriff. It was a secret, deadly fraternity, operating right in front of the people they were systematically destroying. The financial and human toll extracted by the innocents is almost too massive to fully comprehend. Over the course of their ruthless, unchecked reign, the syndicate orchestrated over 100 perfectly executed robberies. They intercepted heavily guarded stagecoaches, robbed lone travelers on horseback, and completely drained the economic lifeblood of the surrounding mining camps. The sheer volume of raw gold and valuable currency they successfully plundered from the hard-working citizens of the territory was astronomical. In today's economic valuation, the stolen wealth easily surpassed a staggering $6 million. But the lost gold pales in comparison to the horrific, irreversible human cost of their unchecked greed. This was not a gang that believed in leaving terrified witnesses tied to a tree. Their operational mandate was absolute, permanent silence. If a miner tried to fight back, if a stagecoach guard reached for his weapon, or if a traveler simply saw too much, they were immediately, ruthlessly eliminated. Over 100 honest men were struck down on the lonely trails connecting the mining camps. Over 100 families back east waited for letters and fortunes that would absolutely never arrive. Their husbands and sons left to fade in unmarked locations scattered across the freezing, unforgiving Montana landscape. This is the ultimate, rage-inducing tragedy of the era. The honest, hard-working pioneers who risked absolutely everything to carve out a better life in the harsh wilderness were not defeated by the brutal, natural elements or the inherent dangers of the mining trade. They were systematically hunted, robbed, and destroyed by an invisible, highly organized army, commanded by the exact man they had desperately hired to protect them. The sheriff used their desperate need for safety as a weapon against them, turning their immense wealth into a river of tragedy that stained the entire territory. The staggering scale of the deception, the massive accumulation of stolen millions, and the sheer cruelty of those secret neckerchief knots represent the absolute darkest pinnacle of organized crime in the history of the American West. The residents of Bannock and Virginia City were entirely trapped in a perfectly designed nightmare, bleeding out a fortune in gold and human lives, completely unaware that the devil himself was patiently sitting in the sheriff's office, casually counting their money and waiting for the next stagecoach to depart. The absolute breaking point for this invisible empire did not arrive with a brilliant piece of detective work or a dramatic courtroom showdown. It arrived in the dead of winter, under the cover of a freezing, pitch-black night. On the evening of January 10th, 1864, the Vigilance Committee of Alder Gulch finally came for the mastermind himself. The icy winds howling through the Bannock settlement carried a suffocating sense of finality, violently whipping snow across the wooden storefronts. A heavily armed mob of over 70 furious citizens, their faces partially obscured by heavy woolen scarves and the dark shadows of the night, silently surrounded the residence of Sheriff Henry Plummer. There was no formal knock on the door, no presentation of legal warrants. and absolutely no opportunity for the charismatic mastermind to talk his way out of the trap. The men who had once looked up to him as their ultimate protector, the very citizens who had blindly cast their votes to give him the sheriff's star, now dragged him out into the biting cold, their rifles raised and their eyes completely devoid of mercy. For the very first time since he arrived in the territory, the polished, aristocratic facade of the gentleman sheriff completely shattered into pieces. As the armed mob forcefully marched him through the frozen, muddy streets of the mining camp, the terrifying reality of his situation finally took hold. He was not being escorted to a secure holding cell, and he was certainly not being taken to face a territorial judge. He was being marched directly toward a towering wooden structure looming in the dark, desolate edge of town. This was not just any execution site. In a twist of dark, almost poetic frontier justice, the vigilantes had deliberately chosen the exact same gallows that Plummer himself had officially commissioned and built with his own hands under the guise of his legitimate law enforcement duties. The very timber he had ordered, the heavy wooden trapdoor he had personally tested to execute petty thieves and maintain his fraudulent image of law and order, was now waiting patiently to claim his own life. Standing in the freezing shadow of his own wooden creation, the sophisticated mastermind completely deteriorated into a pathetic, desperate shell of a man. The articulate vocabulary and refined manners vanished, replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. He dropped to his knees in the harsh snow and frantically begged the vigilantes for a fair trial. He pleaded for the exact same legal due process and constitutional rights that he had violently, permanently denied to over 100 innocent prospectors. He cried out to the men he once commanded, calling them by their first names, desperately trying to manipulate their human emotions. But the mob stood around him in absolute, deafening silence. Their faces were carved from freezing stone. They had already seen the tragic aftermath of their friends and brothers discarded in the sagebrush. They had absolutely no interest in his legal arguments. Realizing that his charismatic charm and hollow pleas for formal justice were completely useless against the furious crowd, Plummer resorted to the ultimate, primal language of the gold rush. He appealed directly to their raw, human greed. Panicking as the rough hemp rope was thrown over the heavy wooden crossbeam, he made a staggering, unbelievable final proposition. He looked into the eyes of his captors and frantically offered to literally buy his own life. He begged them for just one single fast horse and exactly 2 hours of freedom. In exchange, he swore on his soul that he would ride out into the freezing wilderness and return with his own physical weight in pure, stolen gold. It was a massive, desperate confession, perfectly disguised as a bribe. He was openly admitting that the vast missing fortune of the Innocents gang, the millions of dollars systematically stripped from the stagecoaches, was safely buried somewhere nearby, heavily concealed in the rugged Montana mountains. He was offering them an absolute fortune, enough raw wealth to make every single man in that furious crowd incredibly rich beyond their wildest dreams. But the absolute tragedy for Henry Plummer was that he had finally pushed his community completely past the point of greed. The vigilantes did not want his dark money. They wanted absolute, permanent vengeance. When the crowd coldly ignored his multi-million-dollar offer, the condemned sheriff realized his fate was completely sealed. He had only one final pathetic request left to make. As the heavy, scratchy noose was roughly secured around his neck, he stopped crying and looked at the men adjusting the knot. He begged them for a good drop. In the grim, dark mechanics of the frontier, a good drop meant allowing the condemned man enough physical falling distance to cleanly snap his neck, ensuring a swift, painless, and immediate end. It was the absolute bare minimum of human mercy one could possibly offer to a fading man. The Vigilance Committee, however, possessed absolutely zero mercy for the architect of their nightmares. They completely ignored his final desperate plea for a painless exit. They intentionally denied him the clean drop. Instead, they hoisted him up slowly, deliberately, ensuring that the heavy rope simply tightened around his windpipe. The charismatic gentleman from Maine, the mastermind who had orchestrated the most sophisticated criminal empire in the Western Hemisphere, did not pass quickly. He suffered in agonizing, excruciating slow motion. He fought and violently thrashed in the freezing night air, his face turning a deep, horrifying shade of purple as his lungs frantically burned for oxygen. The furious citizens of Bannock stood in the snow and silently watched him suffer, making him feel a fraction of the immense physical pain he had inflicted upon the territory. When his body finally went completely limp, turning slowly in the bitter winter wind, the era of the Innocence Gang was officially eradicated. The sheer brutality of the mob did not end with his final breath. To ensure his permanent, ultimate disgrace, the vigilantes absolutely refused to allow him to be laid to rest in the consecrated ground of the local town cemetery. His body was left hanging from the wooden beam, exposed to the harsh, freezing elements until it was completely frozen solid. He was eventually cut down and unceremoniously left in a shallow, unmarked location in the frozen dirt, completely stripped of any dignity, any historical legacy, and any remaining power. The gold badge he had weaponized was gone, and the man who had terrified an entire territory was reduced to absolutely nothing. But while the corrupt sheriff was violently erased from the earth, he took his darkest, most valuable secret directly down into the dirt with him. The massive, sprawling fortune he had offered to the vigilantes on the gallows was never recovered. The $6 million in stolen gold, the dark profits of over 100 tragic ambushes, simply vanished into the vast, sweeping landscape of the Montana wilderness. This massive, unaccounted wealth immediately gave birth to one of the most enduring, deeply captivating urban legends in the entire history of the United States. For over a century and a half, countless generations of ambitious treasure hunters, dedicated historical researchers, and desperate adventurers have scoured the hidden canyons, the deep riverbeds, and the remote mountain passes surrounding Bannock and Virginia City. They have relentlessly searched the abandoned robber roosts and the old stagecoach trails, desperately trying to decipher the lost geographical clues of a fallen man. Yet, the earth has stubbornly refused to yield its dark prize. The massive hoard of the Innocence Gang remains completely undiscovered, a phantom fortune completely swallowed by the rugged terrain. It is a haunting, incredibly powerful reminder of the ultimate cost of unchecked ambition and severe moral decay. The lost treasure serves as the absolute perfect metaphor for the American gold rush itself. It is a terrifying story of immense, unimaginable wealth forever tainted by horrific tragedy, buried deep in the shadows of the past, forever out of reach. The gold still waits patiently in the dark, silently guarding the legacy of a charming mastermind who thought he could outsmart the devil, only to find himself slowly fading on a rope he tied himself. But what if the entire legend of the charismatic mastermind and his sprawling underground empire was nothing more than a carefully constructed fabrication? For over a century, the story of the corrupt sheriff was blindly accepted as absolute historical fact. However, as modern researchers and legal scholars began digging into the dusty archives of the Montana Territory, a deeply unsettling counter-narrative began to emerge from the shadows. When you strip away the romanticized frontier mythology and critically examine the actual surviving evidence, a terrifying question arises. What if the Innocence Gang never actually existed at all? Modern historians point out a glaring, highly problematic flaw in the vigilante narrative. There is absolutely zero concrete physical documentation proving that a massive, highly organized criminal syndicate was operating under the sheriff's command. The entire foundation of his ultimate downfall rested almost exclusively on the dramatic confession of a terrified outlaw in the freezing woods. We must remember the exact horrific circumstances of that midnight interrogation. A man standing on a wooden barrel with a rough hemp rope tightly secured around his windpipe will say absolutely anything his captors want to hear just to delay his inevitable drop. Confessions extracted under the immediate, terrifying threat of an unauthorized execution are fundamentally worthless in the pursuit of genuine truth. This profound lack of verifiable evidence completely flips the historical script. It forces us to look at the Vigilance Committee not as righteous saviors, but as a ruthless, power-hungry mob. Were they genuinely protecting the vulnerable community? Or were they simply a rival political faction orchestrating a brutal frontier coup? By labeling the legitimate lawman as a criminal mastermind and eliminating him without a proper trial, the vigilantes successfully seized absolute control over the region's immense wealth and political future. The sheriff might not have been a psychopathic predator playing a dark game. He might have been the ultimate tragic scapegoat sacrificed to justify a massive, illegal transfer of power. To finally settle this bitter historical debate, the modern legal system decided to officially intervene. On May 7th, 1993, exactly 129 years after that chaotic winter night, the public schools of Twin Bridges, Montana, organized a highly detailed mock trial. They symbolically brought the ghost of the charismatic sheriff back into a modern courtroom. The legal teams applied strict 20th century evidentiary standards to the 19th century accusations. Both the prosecution and the defense presented their strongest historical arguments to a carefully selected, impartial jury of 12 modern citizens. After reviewing the exact same evidence that once sent a man to the gallows, the jury intensely deliberated. The final result was a stunning, deeply provocative deadlock. The vote was split exactly 6-6. It was a hung jury, resulting in a complete mistrial. In the modern American justice system, the highest, most sacred legal principle is the absolute presumption of innocence. A citizen remains completely innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The vigilantes absolutely failed to prove it in the winter of 1864, and the prosecution could not legally prove it over a century later. Under today's strict legal standards, the infamous sheriff would have completely beaten the charges. He would have walked out of that courtroom a completely free man. This stunning 20th century twist leaves us grappling with a haunting, irreconcilable paradox. The men who proudly claim to bring law and order to the chaotic frontier might have actually committed the most egregious injustice of the entire gold rush era. The smoke has cleared, and that closes the file on today's case. Was Henry Plummer a brilliant, calculating mastermind ruling the Montana Territory? Or was he simply a tragic, wrongfully accused victim sacrificed by a ruthless faction? The absolute truth might forever remain buried beneath the freezing dirt alongside that missing gold. What are your thoughts on whether Plummer was a monster or an innocent scapegoat? Let us know in the comments below. If you liked this video, hit the subscribe button to join American Ghosts as we continue to uncover the shadows of 19th century America's past. Until next time, the journey to expose the crimes continues.